So this is just going.
Yeah, the natural state versus the ideal state. What is the natural state? Sunyata, perhaps you can take the stage now.
Oh God, it's a stage. I'll never get used to these internet
Yeah.
things. All right, here we go. I thought this morning we could start from in this the conversation around non-duality or Advaita and all the different attitudes. There seems to be a lot of attitudes. The difficulty of using words for describing what might appear as the natural state as opposed to the ideal state. The difference between uh, that seeks and or that which needs nothing to be added on. Now, unfortunately, we have to sort of go into talking and thinking about this because everything that seems to happen happens through ideas. What we call the self is built out of the condition to be so. So, for what we look toward as an identity is exactly that. It's what it identifies to. And how it's addressed is that there's an ever present, continuous standing self that appears out of its conditioning, but is also always present, that it's a soul, that it's a spirit, that it's an entity. But this of itself is an illusion. And this is the crux of non duality. The point of meditation or all sense of reasons why to do or take on all these special means like healing, dealing with trauma, is about fitting in. It's about dealing with a supposedly fragmented self, in that out of our conditioning, it doesn't seem to work that we find happiness, because most people are concerned with happiness, or at least okayness, fluidity. So I thought it might be interesting to go into this a little bit. The notion of the natural state. So we can look at this and get an understanding for this fairly immediately, because we're all educated to look so. We're looking at 120 years or more of considering the psychology of a present standing self, that the self is a conditioning through its early childhood, through its education and induction and exposure as an infant, and that it's protected into. And then the advent of adolescence, for where there seems to be exposure with a broader community, for where the child starts getting its independence through its peers, in looking at how other parents and other positions have attitudes different to our own parents, these breakdowns, the types of conflicts that happen in there, the loss of control over children, the advent of the adolescent becoming a young adult, for that it has to be independent in the world, all these things that the parents support the child to be or not, and the subsequent conditioning that comes out of it, the early adulthood, for where it tries on what it's learned out of adolescence and its shortcomings, or the slow maturation and maturity that comes in adult life, young adult, into middle adult, into mature adult, supposedly, for that it stands in an understanding that its conditioning is exactly so, and it works on that maturely with an understanding that these are conditions, and one just has to educate themselves to be able to fit in, because the biggest point for survival is to belong or not, to have an independence against that. So for where all fragmentation shows up in a supposed everlasting standing self, that we call I indicated I am such and such, I am my attributes, I am the thoughts that I think, I am blah, blah, blah. You know, you can see this fairly immediately. We're all versed to consider this. And then for looking for what is wholeness. Now, wholeness simply occurs because life happens. So that, you know, this that we're concerned with, which is mostly in the waking state, unless we're dealing with nightmarish dream state, we're concerned with the waking state fitting in nicely for survival and all those other things. In waking, I am, one recognizes very, very quickly that it's such and such a day, and what we become aware of is our responsibilities for that day, perhaps, or not, depending on how that conditioning happens. For perhaps what appears to be a traumatized person, instantly conflict and anxiety might show up, or for being conditioned so the resentment of having to live a particular way because there's no other way to be, or that one feels resentment towards circumstance of all relatedness because of whatever, because the conditioning is not quite happy with where it's landed to be, and it wants to always perpetuate something better. Seems to come out of the ideas and condition of the self. So with the spiritual order, and I hope this isn't too all over the place, because I'm trying to sort of keep it within this form of what is the natural state, what is the ideal state. The ideal state is for whatever we think will make this better, depending on for where that conditioned self shows up, depending on, you know, what we see to be the action figure for making this work, this life work, and for using those attributes which show up to be the self. What of this is true? What of this is essential? So if we come to an extreme state, you know, we might find that it's very, very difficult to be this self. And so we look to therapy, or we look to meditation, spiritual processes. And we have to ask ourselves, you know, what we're really looking for. Perhaps in and through the people have an understanding of the yogic system or meditation and all the advents of spirituality that generally sort of comes out of the East. What's meant by yoga is the unified state, you know, in that we have an ideal for what was once called God. We wouldn't call it God now. We might just call it happiness or whatever our ideal would say. And so we work to that end. If it's that we look for that is enlightenment, if someone has such an idea, exactly what do they mean by that? You know, are they talking about the natural state of being, or are they talking about an ideal? And this is my point. So I thought, you know, it might be interesting to talk about this. And given that you're going into very, very deep meditation, and it just seems to be you and I, Ekomananda, we might as well see where we can go with this and have a chat. and see what shows up.
I work from a therapeutic point of view. So the language, sometimes we tailor the language to specific audience in order for them to be able to understand the essence of the natural state. Sometimes I feel, or it appears, that if we attempt to speak from the non-dual point of view, the message is too simple, and the mind rejected it. So we are positioned, or it appears that from this position, as a therapy, as a therapist, as a spiritual guide, if there's any, we tend to be mindful. It's not even mindful. It's just happening here that, however, there's this selective process happening, but in a way, what eventually appeared in front of the audience, there's this natural happening or natural selection process happening, so that the language is tailored to the right audience. While here, the Zoom circle, we are infused, and you are injecting the energy, the non-dual energy. This provides a platform for the broad audience to have a taste of what works for them and what's not. What I found in the therapeutic space, there's this language that needs to be sharpened, sure. And perhaps is this body's, I wouldn't say trying, there's nothing to try here. It's the observation. Sometimes when we attempt to use a non-dual language, for example, there's no one here. There's nothing to be achieved. You already arrived. It doesn't really work for those who need step by step a smaller dosage of the unconditional love. What we are holding is a space. In essence, that's what we're doing in the therapeutic, whether it's therapy or not, or Tuesday meditation, or our monthly love circle in person, or even when we socialize. There isn't a personality here, whether it is Sunyata or Ekomananda. What it appears is these two organisms, and there are many other more organisms in different parts of the world. We are simply holding place and allowing this infinite love, infinite wisdom, this natural state to happen itself. But when it comes to delivering an idea, delivering a sharing, when now we're coming to YouTube channel, it's a sanitizing process, it's a purifying process, it's a scrutiny process, so that we get to watch this body. Whatever the body is saying is being watched by the self. And that provides an opportunity to refine the language, whether it's for the audience or for these two organisms. That's what it appears that is happening. The ideal, I mean, what is ideal? This ideal state changes from time to time, and what the mind, what the body thinks, want that ideal state, it's not going to remain permanent. It's an ideal appeared in the head that something gives the body a certain drive because the person says, I need to have a goal. I need to achieve something. Other than that, if I don't have a goal, life is meaningless. And so that ideal state initially, it does somewhat push the person chasing for something. Yes, we may say you don't have to chase, you're already here. But there are layers in the game, in this movie, in these experiences, and somehow the ego, the ahankara embedded in the body somehow constitute this drive that I need to set a goal. I need to have a goal. And there's so many courses teach people how to set up a goal and how to conquer, achieve that goal. And they're happening. And are they totally meaningless? Not necessarily. For everything manifested as it's happening, and we sit in the position, attempt to be non-judgmental. So we have to accept everything as it's happening. Can we take all the steps away from all individuals? Not needed, not important. But the message, yes, there is a message. There is a message. This is it. But can everyone grasp this message the moment they hear it? Not necessarily. It's not designed that way. So what is happening here in Love Circle is a platform for these two organisms to sharpen their language so that the message is clear, succinct, and profoundly thought-provoking. That provides resources, material for the mind to chew on. In the chewing process, the shift happens. The shift happens for what? For less suffering, for less unneeded suffering. But is suffering necessary? Does God exist? If God does exist, why God doesn't take the pain away? Why God position individuals into this very painful trauma? All questions, when the mind is here, there are there are millions of questions, right? But this body, that body is listening, is watching.
Are there any questions?
No, this organism doesn't have
might as well go then.
question.
This is not needed. There's nothing to do here then. There actually isn't anything. There's nothing.
There isn't from the non-duality point of view. From the non-dual, we're looking out the world through the body. The body is the lens, right? It's the vehicle.
So what appears as perception and that space of thought, if you like, because there's so much pressure, that's sort of come up in, the last 30 or 40 years through the New Age spirituality. And I think this has been broken down by the non-dual conversation that of the no mind aspect. Well, actually, it's probably been 70 years since this conversation's been coming to the surface, pretty much through Buddhism, and then subsequently through Advaita of the non-dualist systems, have come through maybe in the last 25 years. So now there's an advent that seems to be happening in the conversation for what is gross seeking, for an absurdity that, if you say first you position it for the supposed advanced seeker, just to hold this as a space for a moment, that in meditation there is no thought, and so the ideal becomes supposedly a purified consciousness. So if one removes themselves from all the apparatus of perception, and this is used in all the systems, then what remains? This happens in the waking state, and in the waking state, for that, the sense of perception or the space of thought becomes non-existent, is not really true. It's not really true. Otherwise, there's no distinction between the waking state and the sleeping state.
Well, just hold on.
So let me just go in a little bit further. So what's done in practices is to put a meditator into an awkward position so that they can't fall asleep. All right? So that the pressure of the body remains, and this persistence is maintained for hours until one overcomes. So this is a very, very ascetic practice, right? And so then it persists. So the awareness of a body will remain for that is held in that state. And what appears to be thought slows down. If it doesn't have anything to get to, it will eventually slow down. So what is seen? And the priority here is a self trying to organize its situation so its condition is okay. But then for what, and in most meditators, when they come out, they have to return to natural life. In other words, one has to sustain the body. Now, you don't really need to worry about this because food is easy and shelter is easy. And if it doesn't happen and you find yourself sleeping under a tree, well, people about you will organize you, particularly here in the West. India, it's a little bit different, but, still things show up. One can survive on a very, very basic level, right? And supposedly that if one sort of gets to this supposed state, and this is where the space of the natural state and the ideal state is blurred, or where thought is constantly sort of coming, that it should be a certain way, that I have to accept this, I have to accept that, I have to accept this, I have to accept pain, I have to accept this, I have to accept that. And then supposedly something has arrived. And there's no more excess. We don't recognize these things necessarily in the West because everything is in the appearance of attainment. So it has to show up as an attainment. And in the West, if they were to see someone sitting cross-legged on a road, contently sitting there for weeks, they would move him and institutionalize him. These things aren't accepted here. There's a certain type of aesthetic. And this would happen in most places, but perhaps, like happens in all places. It's either in the West, it's arranged toward either mental institutions or it's incarcerated if it doesn't conform. If it's not working, it will be put into therapy and psychology to normalize it into a supposed natural state, to reify it back into it being a working organism for the state. So the natural state is appended supposedly to the social state. And we see all this. And there's a type of anarchy that might rise up here. So, like before surviving, one survives, one finds a means. It doesn't take much, maybe a little more in the West, because economies rule for where people are conditioned to be. So there's this always ongoing. But meanwhile, the natural state is here. The natural state is always here. The natural state isn't about conditions. It's about that which is ever present here, but not as an ideal, just as it shows up to be. Everything's okay. That it simply moves and organizes itself. But if any level of neurosis or psychosis shows up, for where it can't move naturally to find its way through, be aware of that too. These things show up to be so. And what forever is not the natural state? You can't really ask that question, because you'd have to have the space where you would look at it. If all of a sudden there's a content, not because of something, but just because it is so. There's an okayness just because it is so. And that appears as meditation for anyone who has taken on that discipline. That quietude seems to be there. That okayness seems to be there. And, perhaps for where the physical condition isn't really conflicted that much, but to find warm if it's cold or a little to eat isn't so hard. But the ideal state, preferential state, favors the space of thoughts which move toward that. And in this, there seems to be anxiety, emotion. Because when the feeling state of the body is just an okayness, if it's just let to be, even with pain being there, there's an okayness. If it's allowed to be in the natural state, it just sits with that. If there's a conflict from ideal circumstance, there's a movement away from. Not to say that this is anything wrong or right about this, it's just looking at how it shows up to be. And there seems to be something that shows in what we call emotion, where there's conflicting thought, or favourable thought for that matter, that sort of creates success and happiness. There seems to be a chemistry that happens in the body, and it can be slightly removed from what the natural state is, which is just an okayness. It seems to be lost in that chemistry. Feeling changes in the body, and it also seems to affect the thoughts that arise. And the thoughts that arise seem to be built somehow almost instantly through what appears to be condition of an ever-standing self. But nothing of this is solid. The worst thing that generally happens if one doesn't react to it is if an emotion is very conflicting, one will overcome it in sleep. Perhaps not. If there's trauma, something that's been conditioned so hard, may need therapy help. But the natural state persists. Even desire is really coming back to draw these excesses. It's only in thought and belonging, in social circumstance, and the habituation of that, where this shows up. Otherwise, everything just resides in the natural state. And if individuals are in their okayness, this would be regarded as a luxury for those who are in a social condition where they need to be able to move collectively together in that natural state to come back to okayness, where there's war, conflict, or where social conditions need to be organised together, cooperation. But really, there's no removal from the natural state. too much emphasis has been put on developing the right condition, whether this shows up as an appearance or as a circumstance, a set of acquisitions, or cooperating, or developing this perpetually ongoing, or looking really, really carefully at needs, communicating for them, or communicating what seems to show up, all happens in this. That appears to be the waking state of exuberant life. Whether it seems to be quietude or exuberance, this has an atmosphere to it.
Let's turn off the phone. It's gone. Then
Oh, the better part of the conversation's gone off, has it? Nothing happened.
No, it happened just now. It went off.
All right, I do. Yeah. Seems to get into a flow. Are we back?
Okay, we are back. We got a little bit of internet issues. Sunyata, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you well.
Good. Please continue.
So would this show up on the internet as a big gap or something?
It's where we're
That was the
lost.
question.
We didn't talk about it. You can pick up a little bit
Sorry,
where you were
I can,
before.
I
It's
can,
fine.
it still seems to be running slow for you, and it seems okay here for me, which might be deceptive. These become metaphors for the natural state. And you appear to be frozen.
Life
And
is
this could be
deceptive.
appearing to be all broken up and garbled. Is
But
it?
just continue to talk. The system will record what needed.
Shall I carry on? Or
Yes,
once
please.
upon a time we videoed this and coming and going, so I'm just sitting back until it seems to be flowing again. Or I can speak because I seem to be
It's
clear, but I'm
flowing.
not sure if this is showing up. So let me
It
carry
is
on then.
clear, Shinyata. Can you just please speak? Shunyata, can you please continue?
Yes, I will. Um, well, nothing needs to happen in the natural state, but that things arise and occur to be so. So it's very, very simple. It's very, very simple. And I can understand for where it looks to be that desire needs to be corrected or condition needs to be corrected, in that it appears to there really isn't any separation in this. The separation shows up in that early condition of a child for fitting in appropriately. And you can understand why individuals believe that if they arrange their conditions in a certain way, then everything will work out. From a functional point of view, this is in degrees true and also not. For that we call meditation or contemplation is just simply looking at that. In the spiritual practice, the idea is that there's some superior position for that it holds space. If there's misunderstandings for what supposedly is known and for what looks like wisdom, accumulated wisdom through experience, and perhaps this is true and perhaps it's not. Perhaps wisdom of itself is being able to hold a space for where it doesn't quite have an understanding. An understanding is a holding and looking at things very, very carefully before you actually know. Because knowing is very, very marginal. What we need to know seems to be very, very simple for a basic life, for a simple life. And desire looks to be the culprit. It's made subject to be the culprit for all levels of suffering, misappropriation. And so one is encouraged to meditate and to contemplate and to consider things carefully. And what one is aware of is looking at a condition, a set of ideas, and ideas and conditions that appear to be a self, that seem to have a corralling and rallying effect to thought, or a self that looks to be a filter through its conditioning, what we call an ego, and its appropriateness or inappropriateness, or appropriateness when it's inappropriate. And the advent of desire and all these things that we aspire toward, the seeker. And these are all just appearances that we contemplate, perhaps. Or respond to, or react to. In accordance to the supposed self-willfulness will occur. But all that shows up as self, a condition, set of conditions, all learnt behaviours, and its appropriateness or inappropriateness makes for supposedly the okayness. But is that really, really true? These things just happen. There's not much thinking in it. In fact, people are more likely to say they don't want to think. Perhaps, that's understandable because when they look, they just see their own conditioning. Or that an attitude that their thinking is superior or inferior. The thoughts which seem to show up as mind and all the filters that seem to use the energy natural of life seem appropriate or inappropriate. Where choice shows up seems to be marginal. The idea that we develop a greater awareness. Is it true? Or altered consciousness? You can see all the problems of this. They just get apprehended by desire. Nothing right or wrong in any of this. It's only really concerned with workability. It takes on a moral priority if it seems to be systemized to be so. But this is all about workability. The organism's concerned with just simple workability, except for where it gets loaded with desire or excess, habituated for desire of excess. And anyone who has experienced these see that the excess goes to excess until it's not even satisfiable. But for simple things, one resides in the natural state. And there's just this life seems to have its own inherent beauty. Seems to find joy in its simplicity. It seems to find unity in it all. There's no issue with ideas. Without ideas, this would be marginally different. Perhaps we might still be just animals. And for where are we not just animals, but perhaps we martyr ourselves to a cause, become a great I am. But this is all just conditioning. Whether it be for small things or some great action, spirituality, or for what is called God, is only known through words. But what is it? But we think that we work to get to this natural state or to be meditative seems to be here. It doesn't require anything special. Whether we're in tasks of making things nice, cooperating, or in our own solitude. The natural state seems to have a beauty about it. And not because it's about acceptance or that conflict doesn't show up, that perhaps has its appropriateness too. And for where opportunity shows up, much seems to be in the nature of developing language with one another. That we call understanding and the space for wisdom. Because both understanding and wisdom isn't about knowing, it's about holding space for this to be so. It's not about acceptance, it's about creating space, looking at how things show up. That's called an identity is actually just identifying conditions. That's called a self is just identifying conditions. And if it makes a state out of being natural, then it seems to even want to fight for that. Well, this seems foolish because the natural state isn't a state at all. It's not a condition. So maybe I should call it what is natural. And it's not to make conditioning wrong. The infant wouldn't know how to protect itself if it wasn't for conditioning. A baby doesn't even discriminate between its own excrement. It's not that conditioning is wrong or right. Perhaps it's just not fixed. And that we call the self, in its identifying to conditions, is just conditioning. And that is called liberation, is really liberation from that. Not because anything needs to change, because the natural state is existent, always. There never was a self. but that the organism worked nicely in cooperation and hopefully communicated for its needs extra. And if other human organisms communicated nicely with wisdom, the space of wisdom and understanding, not because of what they know, but there's inherent beauty appearing in many places beyond that knowability. Not to dictate, not to dominate, not to make political, but to recognize unity. Not to be naive or ignorant, to give equal wisdom and understanding over that it shows up as a self condition. It isn't self conscious, it's just conscious of its condition. It's simply awareness through the perception, nothing special. So meditation isn't an attainment, nor a condition. Perhaps an attitude at first, or perhaps just the natural state.
something came through as I sit here. This conditioning, an image appeared. It's like the conditioning. It's like spiral shape. So the conditioning continues to happen. So the organism goes through conditioning, conditioning, conditioning. This conditioning expanded. Eventually, the maximum conditioning, when it's reached, it begins to deconditioning and eventually reach the natural state. So the ideal state where the mind and organism are seeking for, each time when it arrives to an ideal state, this ideal state itself will destroy itself, or the next ideal state manifests, appears in the head. So the mind, the body goes to chase that ideal state. When they arrive at that ideal state, this ideal state will toss off itself again and then set another ideal state. So this continuously happening, eventually it begins to deconditioning. And that just appeared. And I thought this analogy is actually very interesting. So if I look at like a scale, so it's conditioning 1, conditioning 2, the condition becomes bigger, 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 and it began to expand, expand, expand. And once it reaches state, the deconditioning begins to appear. There is less need of seeking for that ideal state or the natural state. So the natural state begins to appear, start from one dot, and then eventually you expand into the whole universe. You actually reside in this natural state, and then there's no more seeking.
Well, the natural state couldn't not be here. And the conditioning is just a word for something that shows up to be so. There's nothing wrong with conditioning, but that we obsess about it or dictate it rather than just communicate for it. Perfectly fine to have ideals. Ideals have their own beauty, and one might communicate for it because it has an interest in it. And finding language about that is perfectly good too. This is the natural state. There's no removal from it. So those oscillations that you think about aren't the concern of any individual per se. They just arise as thought because they seem to be supplanted by others. Then one assumes that that's the natural state. So it tries to abide in it. And, for the infant and the adolescent, there's a certain amount of appropriateness, maybe even for the young adult. There's one thing about being in the human animal, it's mammalian. What it calls love is about warmth and okayness. But, this is also parallel with incredible vengeance. Killer whales have sharp teeth. For this universe, it perpetuates itself by consuming energy. It consumes, from the elementals up to all the organisms. So one simply, hence you can sort of see the ideals of something like Jainism that doesn't want to take any life but that's necessary. So they only eat the plants that arise on the surface so as not to even kill organisms. They become fanatical in these extremes. These are ideals. And, and then by being in such a position, one could say that they have attained the appropriate position of being truly good or something. And we could do this, if we wanted to. It seems to be a lot of energy. We could walk naked in the streets. And I'm not suggesting that, but just to look at what an ideal can be. It's very simple. Would need very little luxury, and not to make anything wrong or right about anything. But we can perhaps note that in our own life. If we were to really sit with the natural state, it becomes very, very simple. Doesn't really need much. But that the ideas are there, there's an habituation. When I get this, I'll get this. So we do this to excess until we realize that it's not true. And for what shows up as a consistent identity being self is somehow, and that thing that we call ego is the conditioning habituated, perpetuating. Whereas in the natural state, these things would just simply arise as the natural state. One eats a little bit of food. If this was conditioned to like to paint and draw things, it was always praised and got warmth from it. So the child perpetuates itself. If you look at any inclination, whether it's infantile or adolescent, you'll see where any obsession would occur too. And I'm not saying any is right or wrong. All this seems to be around how the organism and mind affiliated, and the habituation and the appearance of what we call human. And this all goes into identity, what we identify to, what we want to belong to. And, we can see through any, once an individual, a supposed individual, has lived up to their 40s or something, they've seen enough of life to start perhaps being aware that the rat in the wheel is actually the identity, identifying with the identity, perpetuating. That's what we mean by ego. And not that there's anything wrong with any of that, but it obsesses with itself like it's unified. It's not unified. That's why it constantly fragments and breaks down, because it goes against the natural order of it just working as an organism. It's really simple. What shows up to be, doesn't really reject things. There's nothing wrong with belonging, except, in a certain instance, it might be inappropriate to be there, or there might be excess in it and foolishness in it. So one simply says, no, not that. Not that. Not to be condemned for however this has shown up in the past. Now, right now, in fact, everything, it is here as this. Everything is here as this. It doesn't matter all the misappropriations. Perhaps for what we call forgiveness. But also seeing this habituation and say, well, this habituation, there's nothing grand in this. And there's nothing so defiled either. That here it can't return to the natural state. And then the conditioning seems to be different. It's not so hard It's not so hardened, but for where there's habituation, what it favors, what looks to be a taste, what it likes to see, what it likes to taste, what it likes to smell, what it likes to feel. It's all in the perception. And that's been organized around conditions. And that we sort of put the hat on of a great I am, a self. This is this. This I am. That's the biggest cage. And not the conditioning. It's not the conditioning. It's in the identity itself, that there, grip there, in that there's an ever-standing self. The liberation, that's what they say, Jiva Mukti, liberation from the soul. And why people are terrified with Buddhism, because this message has been here for aeons. It says nirvana, like it's an ecstatic state. But it also says annihilation of the self. And everyone goes, oh, because they think they're going to be cut off from the things that they like. Yes, and Buddha will say, no desire, not this, not that, not this, not accept this, do this. Jesus, all these avatars sort of say, no. It's just in the self. There is no self. It just appears to be a self because of a body showing up like this. It has inclinations, so they go, oh, that's an individual. It looks to be an individual to us. But it's not something that needs to be maintained, except for where it is in its natural state. So it will go naturally to things that are more harmonious. Why would you do things which are going to create constant conflict? It's so easy. Why would you want to create conflict? And if you have something special which seems to create conflict in the other, then what we do is we communicate. This is the beauty of words. And you just simply say, I seem to find beauty in this. What do you think? And the other might be okay with that or not. So then there's an awareness about the conditioning. And then you look at the conditioning and you look at multiple forms of conditioning and you watch the coalitions of conditioning, and this all appears as thought. And thought and what we call thinking is just that thinking between supposed thoughts. But if you look at this really carefully, they just appear through stimulus. If there's no stimulus, those thoughts don't arise. Once the stimulus is not there, there's nothing here. It's just this. And there might be a sense of celebration in it. One likes a beautiful blue sky. Wonder why that is. Because it's warm and it feels good. Human beings have worshipped the sun. I wonder why. And we attribute all words and symbols and poetries to these things. Why? Because it gives us basic life. And that appears as knowledge seems to come through just these observations of understanding natural law, what appears to be natural law. And somehow what appears to be natural law seems, in some degrees, if it's correct, to align to the natural state. So even thought appears in the natural state perfectly. And the choosing is not so difficult because it's only between very, very small degrees, tiny little degrees, and things settle down. Just a simplicity. not for perpetuating some long-winded self-standing self or set of conditions, but in the harmony of this, even that shows up to be so. There's a beauty to it. There's a beauty to it. And this isn't a new message. It's been here for aeons. It's just that the language changes. And then people say, well, this natural state you can't get to unless you do this. No. It's always here for everything. All sentient and insentient, all life. It's here, always. It's only through the filter of a condition and manipulating to have that for self to be so. And in those excesses. But the more this is like Tao, this is just the natural state. Harmony seems to happen in it because the natural state seems to be very simple. It doesn't have sophistication. It doesn't need it. It doesn't need excess. But it doesn't mean it has to throw away all beautiful things. It doesn't have to be extreme. It doesn't have to be fanatical. If it wants to, it shows up to be so. Because these conditions look to be solid until they're not. And then they just appear as soft, marginal little choices in a day. Do I want to eat breakfast? No, I'm not hungry. Oh, it's a lovely Saturday. Easy day. Paint a picture. Work in the garden. Get on top of a job. Or sit easy. Ring a friend. Whatever. It all has its inherent beauty. This isn't a new message. It's just that we have to develop words with one another all the time because language changes. What was once English 400 years ago, if someone spoke that English now in an English, no one would understand them. Language is always changing. It's all organic. This ability to have an intellect and to be able to contemplate things really broadly is something human beings have developed together. It's all organic. It's all part of the natural state. It has its inherent beauty. Even to find differences has its inherent beauty. It's about life. It's about, there seems to be a refinement. There seems to be constant change. This is all life. It's the natural state. It's just this. It is beautiful, even in conflict, but that we communicate for it. Not that we go to violence. We communicate. Perhaps even harshly sometimes, but with a listening. This is the natural state. It's not the conditioning. It doesn't need the conditioning. But that certain things were learned, that we're in okayness and find harmony. And that's the natural state. The hard yes and no disappear. And that's the natural state. Sometimes there's strength in words. That's the natural state. Sometimes there's overwhelm and learning how to sit with it. It's also the natural state. There even appears to be mastery. And that's the natural state. But it's not the condition. It can't even really be spoken for. It's in what they say is an iota of a moment, without a thought. That's also the natural state. Thought is always constant in the waking state. That's also the natural state. There's awareness. Awareness of the subtlety of what we say is consciousness and the perception of that which is light that goes beyond light, which goes to nothingness and meaninglessness. That's also the natural state. And there's a beauty in this. There's an easiness. There's even what we might call bliss, but not to make a state out of that. It's also the natural state. To be okay with awkwardness, to be okay with arising emotion. It's also the natural state. All these things. To understand the difference between body and feeling in the body, and thought, and the emotion that occur through thought and affect body, and for where words appear and seem to amplify conditions. That's also the natural state. There's an inherent beauty in this all. This is this. Hearing in every moment. This is this, appearing in every moment as that too. And that is aware. It's also the natural state. There's an inherent beauty. There's an onus on awareness. But there's also absolute freedom in this. It's also the natural state. There's wisdom and understanding and knowledge. It's also the natural state. These things are null and void. It's also the natural state. Nothing of this is new or old. There's no time in this. This is also the natural state.